where history meets environment is a great place to focus on because it does include so many aspects of land-based learning and the connection to place and research and hope for the future. And I think all of us kind of have things like climate change looming for us in the foreground and background. So it's a timely topic. I thought I'd just give a highlight of some of the experiments in place responsive learning design that myself and others have been involved with over the last few years, and mostly centered in North Central British Columbia. Just a little bit about my approach to teaching. I'm a former K-12 educator, teaching mostly high school social studies, and now more recently, in the last few years, involved in teacher education at the University of Northern British Columbia. And it's been great work. And our students, both in the high schools and in post-secondary, are hungry for learning more about land-based, place-based, in situ, place-conscious, place-responsive learning. Lots of flavors. They all have slightly different purposes and meanings, but they certainly have their center around place. And my particular approach is connect this work with social studies and history education, which is what I mainly teach about. Here are just a word cloud of ideas of things that sort of swirl around my mind. That I generated this from a sample piece of writing, or a few sample pieces of writing, just to see where my thoughts come from. And I thought I did a nice job of capturing some of the ideas that are important to me. Um, our students, and by this I'm speaking broadly, this is K to 12 students across Canada, in British Columbia and the places I work, but also our post-secondary students. For me, that means teacher candidates or student teachers. There's certainly a lot of realities, and four realities that have occurred to me as I was putting this together, that are persistent realities for students are the challenges related to the environmental polycrisis, of course, the center of which has climate change, not limited to the climate emergency. We certainly have other problems that we're dealing with, and the results of which can often be environmental anxiety and perhaps even more importantly, environmental apathy. The ability to tune out to important problems, both locally and globally, has never been greater. There's a mental health crisis underway, if you haven't noticed, and of course, there are multiple causes depending on who you talk to. But we might think about addiction to technology as being part of this, and also the lack of grounded connection to place and loss of community, the nature deficit that Richard Louv describes. And there's also a prevalence of manufactured, manipulated realities, in which truth and reason are up for grabs. It's an assault on truth and reason. This has been a function of probably every society from the dawn of time, but we have it in our face. Seems like all day long, and it's depressing. And students are certainly catching up on this as well. The ones that aren't catching up on it are victims of it, and the ones that do kind of realize what's going on are tired of it and feel exhausted by the inability of people to reason through things and speak truth. And certainly, the difficulty in these socially, politically, economically, culturally, ecologically uncertain times of building accounts of history. Um, and I think this has been mentioned already too, that these acts are increasingly looking like cultural warfare, and the purpose in laying out these realities of these crises is to encourage us to think about ways in which we can still have hope and joy in our work. And I think has been mentioned by all of the speakers. One of the low-hanging fruits of doing that is to get back to the land, to get outside, to reconnect with nature, and to at least ground our problems and our worries and our concerns and our inquiries in real-world scenarios and real-world cities and countrysides and forests and streams and oceans. And if nothing else, we've created a more beautiful place in which to be anxious or to be apathetic. But I've got bigger hopes than that. When it comes to teaching social studies or history, we certainly have lots of options. The student teachers I work with often realize that there's not just one way to teach social studies, there's many. And they don't necessarily have to pick one lane, but they often find themselves gravitating towards one way or the other of teaching social studies. And I feel like my primary job is to avoid the possible number 11, which is just to grab a textbook and some worksheets and hope it goes okay for kids. So within that context of how to teach, what to teach, and looking for a role for place, I think we come around fairly quickly to the power of stories and the realization that stories are at the heart of our work as history educators and social studies educators. Um, there are certainly lots of possibilities for storytelling and situated narratives in social studies and history. The question is how to get at them, and so that isn't just students listening to stories, which is important, but students actually actively engaged in story work, which is the construction of stories and the honoring of stories as valid data. And so the activities that I'll share relate very much to story work. The storywork term, one version of it comes from Joanne Archibald's work. Her book was actually called Indigenous Storywork, in which she lays out her vision for storywork. And it's the idea that making meaning from a story can happen in many ways and over time, and that they become living documents of people's meaning and the way in which they make meaning, and that storytellers learn that their stories have a power to communicate information in a special way. Linda Tuai Smith reminds us that the story and the storytellers serve to connect the past with the future, one generation with the other, the land with the people, and the people with the story. Stories are important. Stories help define our environment, and stories help negotiate relationship with land. And this is, of course, important for Indigenous peoples, but it's important for all of us. We all have connections to land, and we may not all of us be on a traditional territory that's traditional to us, but we certainly have landed in a place that we, whether invited or not, have a responsibility to learn and learn from and learn on and learn about, especially learn from. That picture happens to be a pit house that was put up by this educator, Jennifer Piggin, near Prince George, near the university site, and it's been used as a teaching tool for a lot of people over the last 15 years or so since it was built. So, how do we respond to place? And one of the ways I'm a geographer, actually, not a historian. So, I turned to Gritzner's famous statement, what's where, why there, and why care. And this is a way that we can certainly bring students to start to encounter place and ask the kind of questions that will help them get to know it better. We're looking at flooding in the Fraser Valley from a few years ago during the so-called atmospheric river, some urban expansion, and the tar sands of northern Alberta. Sorry, oil sands. We have to use the correct term. And then some local images again that might beg us to ask about the where of teaching and learning. There is a homeless camp called Moccasin Flats in Prince George, where I live, and the pulp mill, one of the drivers of industry in the region, and sort of an anachronistic stockade built by what was the Hudson's Bay Company fort at Clutleton Memorial Park. It was a recreation. There never actually was that type of building there, but somebody at some point thought it would be a nice addition to the park setting. And a colleague of mine, Dr. Hart Bannock, is doing a lot of study around this idea that we often know about the what of teaching and learning, the curriculum, and about the how, which relates to pedagogy, but we often don't ask about the where and ask about where learning and teaching takes place. And of course, we know about classrooms and we know about school grounds, but what else do we know about where learning takes place? And as a number of people have mentioned, getting kids outside and looking for opportunities for land-based learning, these questions of where become increasingly important. So over time, myself and others have developed a variety of approaches to story work, and many of these, if not most of them, are place responsive or place based. And I've had the opportunity to experiment, develop a lot of these with high school students over my teaching career, and more recently to develop and teach these activities and co-teach and have student teachers teach these activities in the context of teacher education. And in turn, they're bringing those to their students, both in practicum and their early career work. I haven't been doing it long enough that I know what their late career work looks like, but I've certainly followed them for their first few years of teaching. And one of these, Heritage Inquiry, was kind of how I got my start in in this idea of storytelling and the idea that students can be master storytellers. Um, that was the subject of the Governor General's Award from a few years ago, and got a lot of mileage out of that. And I mean, of course, I did thank my students for it, but I mean, I should, that's all I should, that's the only people I should thank for it, because it was their work that that resulted in some recognition, and it was a lot of fun to do decades of work with students where they looked at cultural, place-based, family-based, heritage-based, community-based inquiry questions to connect them with who they were and where they lived. Some great projects over the years that had a lot of fun, and a lot of connection. The one on the bottom right was a student whose family came from a small mill town east of Prince George that no longer exists, Lambing Mills. And it so happens his family had a little museum out there, and we went out to visit a number of times and collected some artifacts from the museum. The museum was abandoned and later burned down. The whole town was vandalized and burned down. And this student happens to be the only one in his family that kind of cared enough about it to kind of keep the records and gather up what artifacts he could. So we have a storyteller now that's pretty much the expert on lambing mills in, I guess, the world, and he shared some of that knowledge with us as part of a heritage project. There's lots of stories behind each of these images here, but a lot of them do have connections to land. The top left is a shop in England where one of my students' grandparents used to run the shop, and Beatrice Potter used to visit the store. There's some neat stories here, but we don't have time for that. A list of sort of these activities that have had some legs over the last few years. And certainly feel free to ask questions about them, or what students have made use of them, or where we use these things. This is a picture of 6 Mile Mary, Mary Quay, who was a woman who lived in Prince George for approximately 100 years, lived out at 6 Mile Lake, which was about 6 miles from where this photograph was taken. And she would make that trek on a regular basis, bringing fish from Tabor Lake back to sell in town. And apparently it was a very common scene to see her smoking her pipe and her dugout cottonwood canoe that she'd use to get across the river. So reef photography is the idea of finding historic photographs in local archives and museums, historical associations, and so on, and having students go out and find where that photograph was taken and recreate the photograph with against the modern backdrop. So this is on the banks of the Fraser River, which this former student of mine, Mr. Larson, has found, I would say pretty accurately, the exact location where that photograph was taken. Of course, the land at the riverbank has slipped and slid a little bit since then, but that was a neat one. These are great. You've probably seen these before in relation to World War II in Europe, where someone's shown a picture of a devastated street against the backdrop of a newly renovated area of town and so on, or pictures from Afghanistan showing women in high fashion walking about in public in a photograph against the backdrop where there's, the area has been abandoned, and the culture has certainly shifted. Um, another technique we're using is called narrative fossicking. And the word fossicking is a term for the search for gold in abandoned diggings, working over old ground looking for new gold. And the idea of narrative fossicking is to search for stories that might exist around already established facts or phenomenon or story threads in a field context, and to ask about what else can we learn, what stories maybe have been buried and might need to be resurfaced, or what stories were never told because the time wasn't right. And this certainly has a lot of relationship to the heritage inquiry that we did. Used to call it the grandmother gap. This idea that culture is kind of transmitted about 50 years at a time, about 2 generations at a time. And I was astounded by how often students would ask an elder or a grandparent or an elderly neighbor a question, and they'd, oh yeah, I'll tell you the story. And then later the parents or other folks would come by and say, we've never heard these stories. And it was, the time was right. They were ready to transmit that, the grandparent to grandchild, elder to youth. That's kind of how culture is transmitted. It also gives us an idea of why, if you break generations, how stories and culture don't get transmitted. And any peoples who have been dislocated, who have experienced war or oppression, and certainly we see this very clearly with Indian residential schools, Indigenous residential schools, what happens when you break generations. This is just a little cabin at Barkerville, BC, a historic gold town near Prince George, fairly near Prince George, and the grave of what we believe to be a Black Canadian who was murdered on his way to the gold fields, and there's quite a story around that as well. And we've used these places as locations for narrative fossicking with students. Event mapping is nothing really fancy here. It's just the idea of journaling, drawing on techniques from nature journaling, and sort of like the field journals of explorers in the past and so on to document a day's work. And so, if students are heading out into the field, as it were, how do we move this beyond just sort of being outside on the land to actually learning from place and engaging with place? So I mentioned in the chat before, we have a program in town where a trap line's been developed, and teachers take students out of the trap line where they meet an elder from the Clethley Tene, and they work through a number of sort of heritage skills and trap line techniques, and they run the trap line, and they learn and hear stories and so on. And rather than just be passive recipients of this information, the students are encouraged to draw what they see and to make a map of their day's thoughts, observations, and connections, and locate them to where these things took place. We call that event mapping. These ones are just kind of off the internet. I don't have the trapline ones here. Story work can also take place digitally. There are some fantastic tools online. These ones I haven't used too much with my student teachers because I've tried to go as non-digital as possible. But when I taught high school geography and social studies, we made a lot of use of Esri's free GIS software. They have something called story maps, as well as using Google Earth to build tours where you virtually fly from one spot to another, whether it's students in geography discussing phenomenon or looking for biome shifting or whatever it is. You can use Google Earth to kind of document some of that work, and it's kind of neat because you can do it with the historic layers as well as the current layers. Another one of these place responsive approaches is an activity I developed with Tom Morton, who I think might be in the Zoom room today. And it's a series of cards that indicate an event of significance to climate history or the relationship between land and people in Canada. And we use these to build human timelines, and they can also be used to build discussions around the impact of significant events around climate change, and indeed to launch inquiries as well. Tom and I had a lot of fun putting these together because we kept coming up with new evidence of some significance in the historical development of the Earth and climate and CO2 and so on. And we started with about 40, and I think we're up over 100 now to these events. Sound walks is another one. This is one of my favorites. It's the idea of experiencing a soundscape with students. And a soundscape, of course, are all the collection of sounds that exist or that can be experienced in a particular space. The Some of the science and art around soundscapes was developed by R. Murray Schafer, who was a composer and who passed away just recently, actually during COVID. Um, and his work is magnificent, and he captures wild sounds to build into his compositions and so on. And we've used these in a number of historic locations where the veil of history is often quite thin. A place like Barkerville with historical interpreters and horse-drawn wagons and people hammering away at the blacksmith and so on. We get this soundscape that has these memories or these reminiscences of past events, and it's a great one because it's sort of so accessible for K to 12. And it isn't just a written or visual based activity, it involves sound. In fact, we often do blindfold people and lead them around to experience the sounds. Another one, this one's a little more involved than a event mapping. It's community inventories. And these are parallel. You can do them as landscape inventories. We're looking at natural features or geographic phenomenon. But they can be just as well used for historical or contemporary purposes as well. The idea is to annotate a map of some place that you're spending time in and just document all of the things that are going on. So for teachers in workshops, we'll often do one like, how can you use the community immediately surrounding your school for learning activities? Where's the closest running water? Where's the oldest business? Where's the Um, the darkest, maybe the most unsafe place at night. Where's the place that has the best chance of hearing music? Where's the tallest tree? Where's the what direction does water flow in when it rains, and where does it go from where it rains? And mapping these things out for a purpose. And they can be generic, where it's just sort of what's going on in my community, or they can be very focused and structured around a specific goal or criteria. A couple more examples there. This was one from some students from a class I taught last summer at Royal Roads. I had to put it sideways because that's the way it fit. And it was sort of all the activities going on around Trout Lake where this person had spent quite a bit of time. Um, and this one was a relationship between species near the Royal Roads campus. Some other activities include art start and photo stories. And these are both ways to use a restraint of some kind um, to portray a space. We often use the art start for students to, in their first encounter with a place, to do a sketch. And that sketch of restraints could be one eye closed. They could have to draw it upside down. They could draw it from an ant's perspective or from a crow's perspective. They could do a continuous line drawing. They could use a different material, like maybe something they found on the ground to draw the picture. They could assemble loose parts or found parts to build their impression and take a picture of it. And then we do a bit of a gallery walk where we get a chance to see, what did you see? How did you encounter this space for the first time? And they can be quick or they can spend some time at it. And there's lots of options, of course, for the young kids, for the little ones, and for older ones, and for adults too. And then the photo stories it was a challenge kind of to tell a different kind of story. Often we do a big story in a small object. And I think a student here had taken a picture of Williams Creek in Barkerville and used it to talk about the leveling of landscape over time through gold mining, of which there's some evidence in the photo, but um, some photos tell their own stories, and sometimes they benefit from a little bit of narrative to accompany the photograph as well. And then the fun ones, I think, were where they took pictures of broad landscapes, but you're meant to look at one small thing in that landscape that was the focus of a story. Other ways of doing it: on a sunny day, to tell the story only through photographs of shadows, and on a rainy day to tell the stories only through reflections in puddles or water. And of course, experiential and land-based learning is important for any kind of a work that tries to connect to place or respond to place. And there's a myriad of these things in any location. I mentioned the trap line. You can see some students gold panning at Barkerville, and this is some student teachers around a Chinese railway worker memorial at the Prince George Regional Cemetery. Um, and we used primary sources from newspapers at the time. The Prince George Citizen archives are digitized, so we're able to grab sources and read out what had been said about Chinese immigrants and railway workers and so on. Prince George used to have quite a vibrant Chinatown, as it was called, and we had to do not maybe not a trigger warning, but kind of like a language warning at the beginning of it, because as you imagine, um, the Prince George Herald and Prince George Citizen, you go back far enough, and the way people wrote about Chinese workers and immigrants, these of course not they were not Asian authors, they were white authors. Some of the language was quite horrific, and you had to have some patience to read through it because it was difficult to work. But then getting closer to modern sources and modern authors, to and Asian authors, Chinese authors, to learn more about that history, and definitely we do that one from oldest to newest, because otherwise, if you go from newest to oldest, you'd leave kind of depressed. And the memorial itself is kind of neat. Our current mayor, Simon Yu, had a hand in getting that thing put up there decades ago. So as we learn from each other, as we reach out to networks, we find out that there are valid curricular connections to almost anything we can do outside, and that there are other people who are doing this work and are doing it joyfully and are documenting their journey. We can start to see how students can situate their understanding of place and provide a basis of observation in which we can do that work of providing agency, working on local solutions to big problems, of trying to find Trying to find, well, Bruce Coburn says, "Love in a Dangerous Time."